Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar of what healthcare can learn from airport design. Aviation, healthcare. You would wonder on the surface, what are the similarities between the two? I'll jump into what's prompted all of this. Is our clients have been challenging us. What can healthcare learn from other industries, not just aviation? Innovation is one of the things that we pride ourselves at Corgan. And said, what can you all learn from other industries? Here we have a thriving studio in our aviation sector, and we have a thriving studio in our healthcare sector. We said, why don't we bring our superstars from the aviation side and marry them with our translators from the healthcare side and see what can we learn from each other. So here we are assembled together. We have assembled a superstar panel of aviation and healthcare designers and planners. Let's start off with some introductions. My name is AJ Thomas. I'm a principal and a healthcare sector lead based out of our Phoenix office. And we'll do a quick round of introductions with the rest of the panelists.
I'm Joel Leffersey, Studio Design Director of the Dallas Aviation Studio.
My name is Scott Gorns. I'm a Studio Design Director within the Dallas Aviation Studio.
I'm Stacy Brimmer. I'm a Project Design Manager on the Healthcare Studio in Dallas.
I'm Shane Williams. I'm the Studio Design Director for Healthcare in the Dallas Studio.
Thank you, guys. We started off with the notion of similarities between the two sectors, with aviation and healthcare. Now I want to see, let's set the groundwork up for that topic. Before we do that, I want to mention that this is an interactive session, not during our panel session, but there is an ability for those viewing this webinar live to pose questions in your chat window. So hopefully we can address them towards the end. We'll have some time left for Q&A. So with that said, let's set the foundation for what are those similarities between aviation, two very complex building typologies. Joel, Scott?
Yeah, so one thing right off the bat is that both airports and hospitals are typically large, process-based buildings where you're going from point A to point B. In the matter of an airport, it's getting you from where you want to be to a plane, and in the case of a hospital, it's to a doctor. And so when you're looking at process-based elements, it's about understanding what are the large programmatic elements that you're funneling people through, and then what can you do to best enhance their experience, because in most cases, in both airports and hospitals, people are under a lot of pressure and a lot of stress in these buildings. So
if we're honest with ourselves, I think both these building typologies have a reputation for the general public of not always being the best environments. Generally speaking, they're buildings, unless you work there, where you want to spend the least amount of time possible. That really came out of approach for a long time for both types of buildings that were just laser beam focused on functionality and efficiency, and the user experience, the passenger or patient experience, was a secondary or tertiary concern. So one of the reasons that we're all here and we do what we do is to dispel those stereotypes and create building types where the users can thrive.
Great. Now that we've established the groundwork for those similarities in our building typologies, Scott, you touched on the passenger flow being a big reason for how you start planning. How do you all do that?
Sure. When we start looking at all the process-based design, we start fundamentally with passenger flows. And what we do is we actually map out from point A to point B where passengers are walking through, so that we can understand where we see large accumulations of passengers. So we take those passenger flow lines and we actually quantify them by a percentage of people within certain areas. So we can understand where there's large clusterings of people and where it's important to include things like decision points and information required, and information to the passengers so that they can make the decisions that they need to make. So we take that and we translate that to a decision point diagram and identify different programmatic needs that will be needed, whether it's in a primary zone, a secondary zone, or a tertiary zone. And this can be things as critical as information kiosks right in the middle, or even just views to the beyond to help orient themselves as a part of a tertiary zone.
Great, so in that whole process of doing the planning based on flow, I'm assuming wayfinding becomes a big factor in this, Joel, you want to comment on that?
It does. So to make these very large, very complicated buildings legible for people who are often unfamiliar with them, these are generally fairly transient populations, we deploy a variety of intuitive wayfinding techniques at a variety of scales. As most airports tend to be quite large buildings, sometimes on the scale of a neighborhood or an urban district, at the most macro level, we draw on a lot of the tools of urban design. So thinking about things like street, edge, plaza, node, landmark at a really big planning level helps us in concert with our flow-based design to create buildings that are understandable, legible, and efficient. We also look at the architecture as well, the form of the building. So looking at things like creating hierarchy of spaces, using light to provide wayfinding devices, using things like repetitive structure to help people meter their journey in a very large space. And then finally, at a much more sort of tactile level, we use things like materiality to give visual cues to wayfinding decisions. Something as simple as changing a floor pattern from terrazzo along a main circulation path to carpet in a secondary or tertiary zone of respite gives people clues at multiple levels as to where they are in space, where they need to go, and how to get from point A to point B.
Great. We heard two main strategies right now. We heard about flow-based planning. We heard about your intuitive wayfinding strategies. How you integrate architecture into those planning decisions. Translating that on the healthcare side, Shane, Stacy, can you comment on those two strategies?
Yeah, well, I would say while we have a lot of similarities, we have patient type flows that we analyze. We try to do as much intuitive wayfinding as possible, so that the architecture itself actually guides patients where they need to get to. We have similar use of typology in terms of nodes and decision points, and trying to reinforce the memory of those decision points. A lot of times we'll integrate art at those points as a way to trigger a memory, as well as views back to the exterior. But I think for us in healthcare, we could still learn quite a bit in terms of the granularity of the flow types that we look at.
I think another layer that we have to consider when you're dealing with healthcare environments is the challenge with material transitions, both in color and in texture, because that has a big impact on the populations that affect us. But I think understanding how aviation looks at those areas of respite along a path of travel, and understanding that what feels like a comfortable distance for me isn't necessarily a comfortable distance for somebody else, and planning that component into it. So using the material differences, keeping contrast ratios in mind with medications and all that kind of stuff, I think is something that we could really expand on in our own hospital designs.
Yeah, Stacy makes a great point about how people perceive their spaces, and whether you are under medical care or whether you're at a certain age where your eyesight's reduced, or certain things can cause you to almost become blind to your surroundings. And there's even a theory called inattentional blindness, that when you're under a lot of stress or you're thinking about a particular decision, you can be completely blind to what's around you, even something that's right in front of you. And my wife says that I'm inattentionally blind to everything all the time. But both airports and hospitals are high-stress situations where people are trying to make decisions. And so things like signs that are right in front of people, they may miss. And so if we can reinforce that with our architecture, it would be a win. One thing that we learned actually from the Parkland Hospital group was the use of eye tracking goggles to help us understand what people are looking at as they're going through the space. And so we've actually done testing in our airport facilities where we've walked people through and tracked via retina scans what they're specifically looking at so that we can pull out focuses from the variety of stimuli that's in a terminal environment, because you're competing with concessions, wayfinding, and other things.
Out of that research, we've gleaned some really interesting information. One is that for a lot of our older passengers, and I would assume the same may be true for older patients, they tend to focus their gaze downward towards the floor, towards the walking surface. So integrating signage and wayfinding elements in the floor is very important for that demographic, more so than high overhead signs. Our eye tracking software and research provided that information that we just didn't intuitively know. The other key element, and you mentioned art, but was I think reinforced with our research, is people's focus on large art pieces. So a great example of how we use that is in Sacramento, that you can see behind me, this giant red rabbit sculpture, which is at the center of the building, and creates this iconic element that you can see from everywhere in the terminal. That, coupled with views to the exterior, means that wherever you are in that terminal, you understand your location, you understand where you are relative to other destinations that you may want to travel to, and because of the size and the scale, it's highly visible to everyone. One of the keys, I think, of making that successful. Art is a great tool to do that as a wayfinding device, and we find that bringing the artist or artists in very early into the design process is key to making sure that art is not just something that you hang on the wall, but is integral to a much more holistic wayfinding strategy.
You know, what you all say here resonates so much with us. We did a dementia care research and trying to understand how wayfinding strategies need to be different with the elderly population. You know, you touched on materiality and how we need to strategically use those materials, like, you know, not just on the signage side, you know, and not using signs per se for signage. You know, that's the key takeaway here. You know, not just using that for your wayfinding process. You know. Let's change gears now to the technology side of things. You know, both our industries have used a lot of technologies, and technologies also are ever changing. So how do you all plan, when you are on the planning side of things, how do you all plan for this ever-changing technology, and how do you adapt and make your designs adapt for those?
We bring up a great point, and frankly, probably one of the biggest challenges that we have as aviation designers is designing in the context of this changing technology, because so many of the critical processes in aviation design are inherently bound to technologies, and sometimes very specific technologies. So activities like check-in, whether you're checking a bag or not, security, making purchases airside in terms of concessions, and then boarding your aircraft as well, are all tied to technologies, and those technologies continue to advance often faster than we can plan, design, and build a building. So we have some really challenging circumstances where by the time the building opens up for day one, you may be 2 or 3 technology generations past where you started from at the initial planning stages of the project. So some of the assumptions we have to make in our early programming phases, they can go out the window by the time you're done building the building. So how do we accommodate that, which is really the crux of your question. The first step is really just awareness, recognizing the fact that whatever we're planning for now is probably not what that building is going to look like in 5, maybe in 5 years, probably in 10 years, and almost certainly 20 years from now, technologies are going to be significantly different. So keeping up to date on what is happening in the industry, trying to the extent we can to look over the horizon to see what those influences are going to be, and identifying the specific areas in the building that are very technology heavy, where the process is based on a specific technology. So again, check-in security, planning those spaces with lots of what we call soft space around them. So as those need to be reconfigured, as they grow or shrink, changes can be made to the building in a way that is relatively, that is not less disruptive.
Right.
Recognizing that anytime you're doing anything in a building, airport or hospital, that is a 24-hour operation is always going to be a challenge. So we can't eliminate that. We just want to mitigate that risk through thoughtful planning of those highly sensitive and highly variable areas.
Joe, on that topic, notion of having strategy of having soft spaces, that's a great takeaway. We have on the healthcare side, we have, for example, imaging. You take imaging modalities. Technology is changing rapidly there, from manual surgery to robotic surgeries and all of that. So, Shane, want to comment on how we adapt or what we can learn from them?
Sure, yeah. While we have a lot of similarities, imaging is a prime example of technology that changes. It evolves every year. And so planning for those spaces to either grow or contract, as you're talking about with soft space around them, is certainly something we focus on. I think for my takeaway, one of the things that we could certainly learn from aviation is how you guys plan for terminals, for example, to grow as the population usage grows, and how that building morphs and grows over time. We've all experienced the hospital system that has just built a building in the available spot that it had to build it for the service it needed at that time, without necessarily a 40-year look ahead of how that hospital system is going to grow and how those technologies are going to change over time, and planning not only micro soft space around it, but really macro soft space around it.
I think another thing to consider, you talked about making sure that there is lots of infrastructure around it, and I think healthcare is always strapped for cash, it seems like, and the first thing that gets VE'd out is your floor-to-floor height, right? That's you're like, oh, well, we can take a bunch of money out, we'll just shrink the building down, but without that space up above, if we think about how things have changed in the recent time period, ducting's getting bigger, we need more space up above ceilings for cable trays and data runs and all of that stuff. That is always such a premium, and by shrinking the building, you're really limiting what you can do in the future.
Especially with COVID and new air change regulations.
Yeah.
Aviation is an early adopter of technology. You name it, you're the ones going out testing. Healthcare is the least, we are risk averse. We don't like touching this unless we are forced to. What are some recent technological advances that you all have started adopting into your designs, and that has made a change in the way you plan things?
Yeah, great question. And for me, I can identify 3 technologies that I think will have a real impact in the next 5 years, to be honest. First is biometrics. Aviation is dependent upon planning for processes and understanding what area you need and how many devices you need. And typically that's all driven by process times and the amount of time we're willing passengers to wait in queue. And if biometrics causes the process time to go down to 0, then a lot of our formulas that we have will break because you simply can't divide by 0. So anticipating that in the planning process, like Joel was describing earlier, is critical so that we can make a terminal that's flexible for whatever the future holds. The second part is automation. So a lot of the processes we have right now are dependent upon people staffing them, or even from the back of house having ramp agents be there to monitor things. And if we can automate the process, it's going to allow a lot of those personnel to focus more on providing a more hospitality-like experience to the passengers, and allowing passengers to take control of their journey and go through it like they want. And then the last component is really blockchain, which I believe will be the catalyst for a lot of this change, because a lot of the concern around biometrics is the privacy of data and who owns that. And blockchain promises to secure that for everyone so that they're comfortable giving this information up. And as we mentioned, COVID has definitely accelerated people's willingness to participate in these kind of programs. But these three technologies are really, I think, going to be the key for the future of aviation design and probably as well healthcare.
You talked on adoption, technology adoption. Sometimes, at least on the healthcare side, there are certain events that trigger that adoption. And certainly COVID has triggered this early adoption of telemedicine. Was always there, but it's just accelerated that adoption. You talked about touchless entries, touchless areas, queuing within areas. Our clients are asking us, hey, do you need all these large waiting areas? Can you shorten them? Can you all expand on the translation side of things? How all of these technologies tie into healthcare?
Yeah, I think you're spot on in the acceleration of it. Healthcare has toyed with the idea I'll use for kiosk, electronic check-in, even advanced phone or web check-in, trying to extend the hospital's brand out ahead of the actual physical visit. But they've been slow adopters of those technologies for a variety of reasons. But with COVID, what we've seen is in particular on the telehealth side, a rapid escalation of that adoption. Some reports have said that we've adopted telehealth probably 5 to 10 years earlier than we would have normally as a healthcare system because of COVID. And then tied to that, of course, is, as you mentioned, the blockchain, because the biggest concern on the healthcare side is the privacy of your medical record, who has access to it, what can they see, and how transportable is it, as well as how accurate it is. You can take your heart monitor and certain EKG things on your phone, but is that going to be admissible to your insurance carrier or to your doctor?
You touched on an interesting point, which is the decentralization of some of those processes. Is a personal anecdote. My father has a pacemaker, and it has Bluetooth, and it uploads information every night to the pacemaker manufacturer and his cardiologist. This is a trend that we're seeing in aviation as well, which is some of the functions that were always physically tied to the building, certainly check-in is one of them, are being decentralized, not only from a single check-in hall, but actually outside of the facility. So I think most of us now purchase tickets, change tickets, get our boarding passes, not in the airport, but in the Uber, at home, sitting out on the back porch. So how that affects the building planning in the future is really a challenging question. Some of the functions that we think of as inherent in the building are going to diminish, things like check-in halls, or as security functions changes, it's imaging, right? That's our version of imaging. As those queues shrink or maybe even disappear altogether, how does that affect the physical facility that we're planning for? So you mentioned some healthcare projects sort of happen with the nearest empty lot. Almost all of the big aviation work that we do in the industry is in the context of master planning. So looking at all of these buildings at a much longer term, how any individual building or structure or facility happens in the context of an entire campus projected out over 20, 30, 40, 50 years is a way to provide that flexibility for a future that we're not always aware of. So while, again, we can't predict the future, if we at least attempt to plan for it, we're probably going to be closer than we would just relying on sort of, dumb luck or just the nearest, the nearest open lot. From a building planning perspective, we actually go through exercises where we create floor plans for future phases. What could this building look like in 20 years and 30 years when passenger loads increase, but also technology changes? So you can have situations where buildings can accommodate a lot more passengers with a lot more throughput with a smaller footprint. We go through those formal planning exercises, again, to ensure that we're creating buildings that are agile, that are resilient to the changes that we think are coming down the road.
Do you all think, like on the healthcare side, the whole notion of centralized and decentralized, that whole concept is applicable? We go through that on a like flavor of the year. Like today, this year is the year of centralization of our services. Next year is decentralized. Where do you see this whole idea, strategy of centralized versus decentralized?
Well, certainly, we've experienced it on the nursing unit configurations. Yes. That's gone back and forth since Florence Nightingale, whether it's centralized or decentralized. The interesting thing to me is aviation looks at it centralized and decentralized on a much broader perspective. We, as healthcare, experienced a little bit of it again during the pandemic because we had gone so decentralized / centralized for a lot of supply storage, a lot of materials that come in and out of the facility. And one of the things we learned in the pandemic response was that became a bottleneck. And so, the discussion of now, do we really want to consolidate all of our material supply chain in 3 or 4 locations across the country that all of the hospitals pull from, or do we want that to be more decentralized and a little bit more redundant?
And what we're finding is there's not a one size or one approach fits all answer for some things. And you mentioned goods in, waste out, and I've recently been doing some planning for that on a large terminal. Physical goods, there's some real logic to centralizing the location of those for ease of distribution, for management, for security, where you're dealing with something tangible. But when you're dealing with something intangible, a data or an automated process, the need to have all of that happen in one place really diminishes as a lot of those capabilities are able to be pushed out to people's individual phones and potentially even decoupled from the building itself.
Right. One thing to keep in mind when it comes to the decentralization process, the idea behind it, right? So in aviation, it makes a lot of sense to centralize that from a staffing perspective, from a redundancy of equipment perspective. But in response to COVID, there's been a relook at this. And imagine if you could split a centralized checkpoint into 3, the opportunity that you would have. You would reduce the potential amount of people in queue. And more importantly, you're able to segregate people from each other through the process. In cases where you might need to do contact tracing or any kind of quarantining, if you are able to separate passengers as much as possible, there could be a net benefit for public health concerns.
And going back to our original topic of technology, it's really technology that allows us to do that. When these processes like security or check-in were tied to personal interaction with another human being from a staffing point of view, they all wanted to be in the same place. If they were relying, certainly long ago on paper copies and again those physical things, there was a strong motivation and a rationale to centralizing them. But as everything in our lives becomes more digital, more ephemeral and more portable, it opens up a lot of opportunities that even 15 years ago just were out of the realm of possibility.
I think on the healthcare side of things, like right now, a lot of labor and delivery departments, they have their own entrance, and it's always been a challenge of FTEs, really, those full-time employees that can guide people, and so that's why we have a lot of that entrance segregated. But if we are able to create this more biometric check-in experience, we have a better chance of distributing the different departments to have their own entrance or check-in process, kind of spread those people out.
Great comments, guys. So technology-wise, is teleportation an option?
I hope not, because it's going to put aviation, out of business. You don't have to fly
Spaceport is an option, right?
Spaceport is an
travel
option,
is happening.
And it's funny that you mentioned that. We actually are exploring spaceports and commercial spaceports with some of our clients. It is a a natural outgrowth of the aviation industry. So even though it sounds science fiction,
it's happening.
It is happening. It is happening in our office.
Great.
Well, and those are starting to engage healthcare typologies within them as well. So your pre-flight check-in and quarantine possibilities are part of the aviation process now.
Great. Switching topics from the whole future-looking technology side to a little bit on the softer side of things, the human side of things. Not to diminish by any means the nature of this topic. Human-centric design is something that we have always talked to, aspired to, even on the healthcare side of things. Aviation has done a phenomenal job. Can you all explain or expand a bit on that whole notion of human-centric design?
Yeah. So for aviation, when we say human-centered design and when we talk about designing for experience, it's really a three-step process. Mm-hmm. First, we go into detail on trying to understand who we're designing for. And typically for us, that was the creation of passenger profiles. And we would create large buckets where we would define people, whether they were frequent flyers or retired tourists or tech-savvy passengers. But what we found is that life is a little more nuanced than that. We're not all just in one bucket. And so understanding, you might be a frequent flyer, but you may also be a passenger with reduced mobility, and thus your requirements are not as black and white as what passenger profiles would dictate. Additionally, there's the incorporation of other users within the airport facility, employees who work on the ramp level, mm-hmm. the agents who work behind the ticketing counters, or the concessionaires that serve your food and coffee. But that's step one. Step two is looking at those requirements as defined by the passenger profiles or the user profiles to create elements for an experiential design, the requirements. So it's ultimately like creating a programming and planning document. What are the performance-based metrics that you want your building to achieve? Mm-hmm. And then lastly, you apply those to a journey map that creates the framework around which you then design your building.
Great, we on the healthcare side have similar profile-based planning on the human-centric design. Want to see how that translates back to us, Stacy, Shane?
I think healthcare has historically kind of had those same big buckets. We sort of started with patients, then mm-hmm. we added families, then we got staff, but there's still these really generalized categories, and I think that healthcare profiles need to evolve the same way y'all's has to really understand. Y'all call it, what is it? The mood. Like the behavior.
Basically behavioral modes or passive
behavioral modes, right. Because it's a whole lot more nuanced mm-hmm. than just those big buckets are. And I think that we can certainly evolve to kind of meet that standard as well.
One of the interesting things about passenger profiles, just kind of doing a deeper dive into the nuance, is thinking about, yes, you have some general profiles which are sort of big but fairly crude buckets that we look at of characteristics and needs and wants. Every single individual, hypothetical individual in that category really has a spectrum of abilities, of desires, of all sorts of characteristics. And the boundaries of those are really starting to blur. I think all of us in our pandemic reality are seeing a blending of our personal life and our work life.
Yes.
So what we're finding is there's new profiles, new characteristics continually evolving. So you have business travelers who may also be traveling with their family. You have frequent flyer business travelers who, as our demographics, as we have an aging population, you have business travelers who have those business traveler needs and characteristics, but are traveling into their 60s and 70s. So they're starting to overlap with retired tourists and senior travelers. The other key component of profiles and experiences, again, we can't get away from technology. Going back to our previous topic, so much of our experience and who we are and how we interact, certainly with airports, is tied into technology. And as that continues to evolve and society's relationship continues to evolve, those profiles change. So while 8-10 years ago, the tech-savvy traveler probably looked like an image of a man or woman in their 30s who was on their BlackBerry device, if people remember those. But that's changing. Is an example. My 76-year-old mother is extremely tech-savvy. My 83-year-old father now uses the iPad. So where we thought these technology relationships existed in a small group, it's continually evolving. It's becoming much more ubiquitous. So it's a constant source of updating and gaining new knowledge.
So one of the things about the passenger profiles that I think is fascinating, I think that where aviation is starting to trend is to start to understand each person almost like a stereo equalizer. There are going to be things that if you do something wrong, it's going to put the whole thing out of whack, right? And so it's trying to identify those things and try not to do those either from an operational perspective or how we do our architecture. So, we don't want to get people lost. We don't want to, clutter things up too much. But the other thing is that we can start to identify strategies to put things back into alignment. And whether that be things like provide families with group seating so that little ones can play while parents can relax, or providing areas for the frequent flyer to kind of duck in and get some work done. Yeah. It's trying to identify those little components, and I think we could talk about where that goes on a sensory perspective, where we now start to design for the 5 senses with that.
Yeah. So while the title of our webinar is "What Can Healthcare Learn from Aviation?" Aviation is learning a lot from the hospitality industry, and I know there's a lot of conversations about that in healthcare as well. But hospitality and the retail industry is an industry that is focused, not exclusively, but very heavily on a holistic sensory experience. And the goal of that ultimately is to separate people from their dollars, right? It's to generate revenue. But they do that by creating wonderful places, wonderful user experiences that people want to stay. And so looking at things like biophilia, looking at things like auditory experiences, olfactory experiences, that's sort of the language of the hospitality and the retail industry that is increasingly informing what we do and how we approach a holistic sensory experience in airports, much for the same reasons. And ultimately, the end result is the same. It's a place that people enjoy being in. It's a place where people want to be, which is, as architects and designers, really, I think, the goal of all of us.
That's an interesting notion of using sensory design into your design and planning. Olfactory is a topic that's trending in our studio right now. How can we engage using all of our senses, not just the visual side of things? Stacy, you want to comment on on the sensory design side of things? How?
I think one of the things that aviation and healthcare has in common is people bring a lot of stressors from the outside into their experience, right? It's not just about the stressors of the airport or the hospital. It's all of the extra baggage that they bring with them.
Aviation pun.
Extra baggage.
Yes. And what olfactory can do, because we actually remember more of what we smell in an experience than we do what we see or what we hear. And there are very close relationships between what we smell, and it triggers different parts of our brain. So it can promote a calming atmosphere, it can increase attention. And so by capitalizing on that dimensional, that experiential design element, we can help mitigate those factors that we have no control over, sometimes like parking or the dog or whatever. We can help control for those situations when people come in and experience our spaces by utilizing some of these other sensory design options.
The concept of smell in design is actually quite fascinating, and when you think about it, the smell always has a connotation of something bad. Like, does it smell?
Yeah.
Means it doesn't smell bad, right? And so I think the key with olfactory design is not only to try and curate the smell, but to be aware of potential issues that could arise from it. And Shane, you brought up goods and trash flows. A great example in the aviation world that I'm sure is shared in both is if you have a public elevator, for example, that also is the trash elevator,
right?
Yeah, and the trash is leaking on the floor, and the elevator stinks to high heaven. Then, as passengers leave your facility through that elevator, the last thing they remember is the smell of trash.
Yeah.
And it becomes your brand.
It becomes your brand. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've seen now airports take specific smells, use it as their brand, and pump it in bag claims, just to kind of counter that potential experience.
And that's coming directly from experiences of retailers and hospitality, whether it is overt, whether you actually can sense it or not. A lot of hotel brands, particularly more upscale luxury brands, they have a signature scent that is common wherever you go around the world to one of their hotels. Very subtly, that is part of reinforcing their brand. Retailers as well, a lot of them have a signature scent, and it's very, very subtle, almost to being imperceptible, but it's really keyed into this idea of a holistic experience. And since we're talking about experience, I think it's really important to understand how our passengers experience in a building. And in airports, it's a challenge because you're dealing with lots of stakeholders. You're dealing with the airport, which is the landlord. You're dealing with individual airlines. You're dealing with one or many separate concessionaires. You're dealing with all the ancillary services offered in an airport. And while we know that those are different groups with different motivating factors and all sorts of different agendas, for a passenger or a patient, it's just one continuous thing. And it starts when you, in many cases, it may actually start as a web presence before you even get to the physical facility. But it starts entering the campus, and in the case of aviation, it really doesn't stop until your plane is taking off. So part of our experiential mapping is identifying all those individual journey moments.
I see.
Those key parts of the process, those key decisions, those key experiences, and crafting each one to best meet the needs of the user.
You're saying that I'm not imagining it when I land in Tampa, Florida. I'm smelling of oranges that's pumped in.
Yeah, intentional.
Intentionally.
Very intentional. Yeah.
Maybe psychosomatic, I don't know. Maybe you just want there to be oranges. I can't speak to Tampa. But certainly when you're going to a luxury hotel brand, certainly when you're shopping in a lot of national or international retailers, whether you can tell or not, there's probably an olfactory component of that. There's an auditory component of that as well. We haven't talked a lot about sound and experience, but there's a silent airport initiative, which won't make the airport silent, but it's a series of very defined protocols to reduce the amount of noise pollution. And this ties into our wayfinding discussion. When there's so much visual noise or auditory, actual noise, you sort of tune everything out, and then it makes it very difficult to hear those critical announcements or see that critical wayfinding. Again, it all ties into a holistic look of that user experience.
Y'all want to comment on that? On the auditory, noises and everything, disruptions that are
certainly
happening?
we've talked about auditory noise in at least in hospital settings for a while. We call it alarm fatigue because there's always something going off, and even it affects the staff because they start to tune it out from an overwhelming perspective. But I think all of that ties in, and what excites me is that similar to aviation, we're starting to design those holistic experiences based on those points in their journey, right? So at check-in, there's auditory things, there's sensory things, there's lighting, and things that we want to help influence that experience so that it's the best experience for that patient that they can have. That to me is what healthcare has sort of pulled from hospitality. For a while we got stuck on just finishes and warmth and nice materials, but it's really sort of the functionality of the hospitality experience that is what's driving the patient experience.
One key I think that's definitely worth mentioning is and this is something that really healthcare has pioneered, is the evidence-based design aspect of this all. That if we can not only prove that it's a good experience, but there's a benefit to the time it takes for patients to heal, or if there's a reduction in anxiety in an airport that causes spend to go up, if there's a tangible return on investment from this, then we can prove to our clients why we need to do these things outside of just for branding or other reasons.
And I think that's a challenge both of our industries share, is dealing with the reality of big data and data-driven design. There's not a shortage of information. It is, how do we take all that information and out of that glean some result that gives ultimately the user some benefit. And I think for the rest of our careers that will be an ongoing discussion as we get more and more information and more kind of transparency in terms of what happens in our buildings.
Being mindful of time, we have questions coming up in the queue, but I want to touch on one topic before we jump on to our Q&A session. Is I think in both industries we face caregiver or the staff fatigue and all, just quickly, 1 minute, quick thoughts on what are you all doing from a design perspective to provide some spaces for respite and for your staff side of things, just a quick thought.
So I think in aviation, there's a lot of focus on providing employees a safe place to be and to know that they're in areas that particularly in a post-COVID world, that they can be where they're not going to be at risk. And so one trend that we're seeing is actually the incorporation of things like urgent cares or other healthcare facilities actually on site at an airport to give employee, not only passengers, but more importantly the employees, access to this if they need to, so that they don't have to be too far from a potential physician if needed.
I think another key aspect is thinking about wellness, the idea of wellness, which came out of really the sort of office workplace space industry, increasingly informing what we do, both from a passenger but a staff point of view. Although most of us experience airports as a passenger, large terminals are a small city of people who go in every day. That is their daily work experience. So providing an environment for them with a focus on wellness, and that's really the whole gamut. So it's air quality, healthy materials, availability of healthy food, access to the outdoors, access to daylight. Sometimes access to outdoor spaces can be really difficult in an airport environment, but we're seeing that is a trend. I think the key is making sure we're thinking about them and acknowledging them as one of the prime users of the building in addition to just passengers.
Right.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, obviously the staff focus in healthcare was on a rise before COVID. Now it's even more important because we've all seen the image of the emergency caregiver out in the hall just, trying to find a moment. So finding those spaces for staff to be able to get away and have a moment to collect themselves, have a rest. But similarly, we have difficulties in finding outdoor spaces for them to be able to get to and have that moment alone.
Great comments, guys. We'll now jump into our Q&A side of things. I don't know if we'll get to all of them. If for any reason we don't get it in this webinar, we'll do a follow-up like in our email or something. We'll get back to you all. So we'll start with question number 1. I think this is right on cue. What would both groups speak to the benefits of off-stage flow of supplies and support to the traveler and or patient experience? Quick thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's really almost the Disney model, if you will, when it comes to this. Is that it's you're really trying to curate that front end experience so that passengers and presumably patients don't have to interact with things that are undesirable. And what this requires is a lot of space. and potentially a lot of pre-planning to ensure that you can get access to in the aviation world to things like the concessionaires from behind the scenes, and so it really requires a lot of cost, a lot of cost preparation in reality.
So while there is a cost to it, it really represents a win-win both for the users and the operators. On the user perspective, we're trying to create these wonderful user experiences that are to some extent immersive environments. You don't want to see the dirty cart of trash being wheeled across the concourse, or the guy with the hand truck full of cases of soda. So it provides just an elevated level of experience for the passenger, much more aligned with hospitality. From an operator point of view, there's a lot of efficiency of having dedicated service areas, service lanes, vertical circulation. You're not having to wait for a crowd to pass. You're able to really create an operational model that's a well-oiled machine because of those dedicated spaces.
Nice.
Same in healthcare. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about the patient flow and mapping those flows. There's a similar process for all materials coming into a hospital, and how can they get from the arrival point on the dock to where they need to go, either on the patient floor or in the exam room, without crossing that patient flow. And the same with trash and stuff coming out of the facility. Mapping those flows is critical to the on-stage, off-stage approach.
One of the big challenges we have in aviation is security screening. So just like a passenger, any goods that make their way airside, the post-security side of an airport, have to be screened. Sometimes that is done on under the building in the basement, or at the arrivals level on level 1, but it can also be done in an off-site facility. So there's actually separate paths for screened and on-screen material going in. Anything going out of the building, it doesn't matter, but there's actually multiple separated pathways. So to make that work, that's actually looked at very, very early on in the planning process. It's one of the kind of fundamental planning elements that we have to look at for large terminals.
Yep.
Nice. Here's the second question. Can we touch on COVID challenges as well? Same common issues with aviation and hospital, and what is different?
Plug your deal.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of work on trying to understand the impact of COVID to the aviation industry, and what it's come down to for us is really three things. How do we socially distance our airports when required? How do we provide for a more touchless processing experience? And how can we integrate wellness into the DNA of our terminal facilities? So with social distancing, we look at that as really kind of a temporary solution to the pandemic. And ultimately, once we do have a vaccine, or once we finally have it under control, a lot of things from that perspective will revert back to normal. But we do anticipate a redefinition of your personal bubble, if you will. So when you plan for seating and hold rooms, this can all have a trickle-down effect. With touchless processing, it's about the technology. It's about finally capitalizing on a lot of the promise of things like biometrics. It's been in the industry for years. We can go back 10 magazine covers and still talk about biometrics. Now is the time to capitalize on that. So whatever was the hurdle before, we need to find a way to get over it. And then wellness, Joel hit on this really well with the discussion about the employees, but we need to create an environment where there's transparency to what's going on. Passengers can provide feedback on what they see or what they don't see, and terminals can reassure both employees and passengers that it's a safe place to be. Now, what's different? Aviation has been hit hard by COVID, and our traffic numbers are way down. So when it comes to social distancing in airports, it's pretty easy when you're down 70% of your typical traffic. Hospitals, I think, are probably experiencing the exact opposite. From this respect, aviation hasn't had to have an immediate response. We've been able to meter it and actually kind of think about it and try and propose solutions that are a little bit more thoughtful than what we initially saw when COVID first came around.
And going back to one of the things we were talking about before, creating these alternate plans or scenario mapping in a way, we've gone through with some of our clients and actually map out what does the airport look like? What does that whole lounge capacity look like when we block off every other seat or every 2 seats? To create contingency plans. Ultimately, this is probably going to be a phased and scaled solution. Hopefully, we will get out from COVID fairly soon. But what happens when the next, God forbid, what happens when the next pandemic hits? What are the plans in place in a way that's, this is a code red or a code yellow or different levels of interventions, temporary interventions that airports need to do. So we also focus on flexible solutions, something that can be deployed quickly and demobilized very quickly as circumstances dictate.
Great.
Yeah, we've had a broad range of responses, right? Certainly, although hospitals are at or near capacity, there's still a reduction in the amount of people that can be in waiting areas or in hold areas. And so throughput becomes an important process, but as important as part of that, what the immediate reaction that we've seen is sort of a pre-screening process, whether that's at the immediate front door or that's at your physician's office, but a way for them to test you to make sure that it is safe for you to be in that environment. Now, certainly as COVID goes away, that will revert back to something closer to normal. But at the same time, it's not going to go all the way back to what it was pre-COVID. I don't think there's going to be some hybrid version of that.
I think waiting will stay decentralized or more decentralized than it was before. And I also think when you're planning, it is going to be more critical to put soft spaces, like we were talking about earlier, adjacent to waiting that then can become the specialized waiting, because my sick is different than your sick when your sick could be COVID. You know what I mean? So you have to think about all of this stuff. It's really going to change how we do waiting.
I think that's a great segue into our next question.
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's...
Can you discuss, I'm just going to read it out for folks who don't have access to our questions, can you discuss what design concept trends you see in both aviation and healthcare in the post-pandemic future?
So there's two that really three I can think of right now. One is corresponding to what the point you just made. I think that in aviation anyway, the idea of what we were calling dwell amenities is kind of what you're talking about, the more soft space. How can we take advantage of spaces and terminals that typically were underutilized and provide people an area that they actually want to be in? And this can be things that range from, like we've seen in some airports where they have rocking chairs along moving walkways. That's an area where someone will sit, whereas before no one was dwelling there. Or it can be large-scale things, like what we see in Singapore with the Jewel. Something that people will typically not go to, but they will if they don't want to dwell in a hold room. The second one that is to be considered is appointment-based processing. And that could really redefine how we do security checkpoints and even FIS processing. And we've already mentioned Disney once, right? So to borrow from Disney again, their Fast Pass system, where you get a specific block of time between 5 minutes, and that's when you need to show up to the checkpoint. Otherwise, wait somewhere else. And then the last component of that, I'm going to.
I'll take it from there. Sure, you bet. So we've touched a little bit about biometrics, but I think the possibilities and the opportunities that biometric and touchless and ultimately kind of more invisible flow-through processing is going to change the way we think about airports and the way people move through them and the amount of time that they spend in them. I think another big trend that you're seeing is this focus on hospitality. If you look at the most recent and the highest rated airports, they resemble shopping malls, casinos, luxury hotels, much more closely than I think what we sort of traditionally thought about what an airport would look like that was built, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago. So there's going to be an increased focus on hospitality and experience. Hand in glove with that is, I think, a bigger change of thinking a shift away from thinking about airports as freestanding infrastructure that lives out in a field at the edge of town. I think you're going to see airports much more integrated with other functions and vice versa. So the idea of an airport city where an airport is one component of a much larger development that brings in office space and innovation centers and tourist destinations and healthcare as well. We haven't even talked about health tourism, which is a whole other webinar that we'll do at another time. But if you think about just the increased urbanization and densification of the world that we live in, I see both healthcare and aviation becoming components in a much bigger development.
We'll take one last question. We have about 2 minutes left, or a minute left. What do we see looking forward in healthcare and aviation spaces in the future? What do we see?
Speaking to aviation, Joel mentioned biometrics, and to me, this is the most exciting part. Is it aviation for the past 20, 30 years has been about the process, fundamentally, the security checkpoint, the bag claim hall, and it's been about building it around the process. And if biometrics can break that down, and make that more freeform, we're going to have the opportunity to really inject some design ideas into our future terminals and make them spaces that are going to be unique for the cities and for the passenger populations.
Mm-hmm. I think for healthcare, it's taking control of your own personal record in whatever form that takes. But learning from aviation and their process and how efficiently people move through the system. I mean, how many times have you gone to your doctor and had to sit, pre-COVID, and had to sit and wait for 30 minutes to see your doctor? The people just aren't going to accept that process anymore. But the best way, or the most efficient way to make that more efficient, is to have your own medical record with you electronically that you share with your doctor, and the data is relevant and valid, so that you don't have to fill out those forms 3 times when you visit your doctor over and over and over again. I think that process and throughput in healthcare has to take from aviation and get better.
Thank you, guys. We're running out of time. I want to thank our awesome panelists. Thank you all for your time, your input. And our audience, thank you for taking time out of your busy days, joining with us. We unfortunately could get through all of our questions. We'll reply, we'll get to you all. This topic is so thought-provoking, so full of possibilities. We'll see if we can continue on this dialogue. Please feel free to contact us, and we'll be in touch. Thank you again.